Mr. Wilson, all parties in this election agree that curing, or at least the halting of inflation, is a key issue of this election. How will Labour control inflation?
This election is about inflation. Inflation is not, as the Conservatives say, about wages to the housewife. It's about food prices, rents, mortgage interest rates. On food prices, apart from renegotiating the terms of entry into the common market, we shall have strict price control at wholesale and at retail level, with fair price lists in every shop, monitored and enforced if necessary. We shall have food subsidies on the most important items in the housewife's family budget. On council house rents, we shall immediately stop the increases due on April the 1st. We shall repeal the Housing Finance Act. On mortgage interest rates, we shall end the chaos in the city, of which we're seeing fresh evidence every day and vast bank profits at the same time, because it is that which is channeling money into speculative ventures instead of leaving it free for industry and for mortgage interest rates for building societies. We believe we must have the borrowing of the country channeled, as it used to be under both governments, into essential purposes such as industry and exports and council house building at reasonable rents, and to help those owner-occupiers living and having to meet high mortgage interest rates.
I'll take up what you said about wages in a moment, Mr. Wilson. Can I first of all say, when you talk of halting inflation, what rate of inflation are you saying is at least acceptable, if not desirable? The Guardian has said recently that any government will have done well if it can keep inflation below 15%. Is that your target?
Yes, this shows where we've got to in this country. The average was 4% under the former Labour government. It was 12% over the last year. All the Conservative papers now, the expert papers, are saying 15, 17, 18, 20. I don't think you can say what the figure is. We've got to bring it down. That is the important fact. A lot depends on world prices, but world prices are affected, of course, by the 20% devaluation.
You wouldn't like to say an acceptable figure?
I don't think one can say. It's got to be lower than it is now. We've got to stop the further escalation, which the Conservatives know will happen. That's indeed one of the reasons why we are told they wanted to have the election. But whatever figure world prices may show, we have got to help the average family in this country, and that's why we're going to have strict price control and subsidies on the basic foodstuffs, and why we're going to get rid of the self-inflicted wounds of government-decreed rent increases.
Can I take up just the question of food subsidies?
Yes.
Isn't the problem with food subsidies as a weapon to bring down prices that somebody has to pay for them? Don't we have to pay for food subsidies in higher taxes?
I'm not running away from that. I think we're going to be facing a very grim situation, and things have got to be more fairly shared out. We can't afford speculators taking large sums out of the large cuts of the national cake, which they've done nothing to produce before. It's shared out among the people who did. As to paying for it, well, of course, provided we don't let all the North Sea gas and oil profits go to multinational oil companies, there's a possibility over the next Parliament to get up to £3,000 or £4,000 million a year for Britain. Then, of course, Mr. Barber, even during the freeze, handed over about £500 million a year to the mainly wealthy taxpayers. We should see some of that come back. There are the defence cuts in defence expenditure, which we say are necessary. And you know, only this week we've seen the banks announcing great profits. They're very shamefaced and sheepish about it, but that's what happens inevitably with high interest rates. I would like to see consideration given, and we shall give consideration to it, to what the Americans do, a windfall profits tax on bank profits when, through no fault or virtue of their own, they are just coining money.
Right. Can we look at wages now?
That's only a start. There are other things I could propose.
Certainly. Can we look at wages now? I mean, much has been made of the so-called pact or social contract which you have with the TUC. And what is at issue, as far as I can see, is not whether it exists. I accept that it exists, it's here in front of us, but whether or not it contains a firm commitment by the TUC to exercise restraint on incomes and wages. Now, it seems to me that it does not contain that commitment.
This is the result of many, many months, a year and a half of regular meetings between ourselves and the TUC. They and we have agreed on what's got to be done if we're going to fight inflation. It's called the cost of living and economic policy. Now, you cannot do that unless first you tackle prices. That's set out in there. You can't do that if you've got an unfair society with people doing nothing at all for the economy, taking large sums of money. You can't do that on the present terms of the common market. We have not signed in blood a document to say there will be this or that form of restraint in wages, but it's there. Trade union leaders.
Where, Mr. Wilson?
Well,
Where?
I'm telling you, trade union leaders said to me, and indeed said on television, when this document was published, look, we can't guarantee that there won't be any get through. We can't guarantee, I think Vic Feather, who was a famous wicket-keeper once, said, I don't guarantee there'll be none getting through to the deep fine leg boundary, but we'll get most of them. And they have shown since that was done, since that was agreed, they have shown what they can do when the whole trade union movement, this never happened in war or in peace before, said what they would do about holding back incomes in order to give the miners a fair wind. Now, of course, there can't be a pact signed or agreed until we're a government, until we can sit down and say, now we've discussed all these things, we've agreed on them, now we are taking this action, that action, and the other action.
It's a hope,
and
Mr. Wilson.
It's more than a hope. It's much more than a hope. I think Mr. Len Murray's statement last week was clear that it is more than a hope, and he's going to be speaking further about this in this coming week. What we do know, of course, is the Stage 3 system has broken down entirely. I'll tell you what one trade union leader said. He said, look, we would rather have a 3% wage increase with a nil price increase than a 15% wage increase with a 12% price increase. And, as they have all said, we shan't put in these big wage claims if we can have some confidence that during the currency of any agreement with the employers, we're not going to be fleeced by by prices rising faster than earnings. And for the first time almost since the war, that has happened in the past year.
Looking at your wicket-keeper, test matches in fact can be lost by the number of boundaries that are scored from leg byes. Could you not lose this test match by just one or two big unions breaking this pact?
I think it would be a very great problem if one or two, and I would rely on the TUC and on a wider system of fairness we would introduce to see that this would not happen. I believe they are conscious that the situation has changed for Britain, changed for the worse, since that document was agreed at the end of February last year. I think they know now that the problem is there isn't going to be any real prospect of major increases of living standards over the next year, especially after the damage done by the 3-day week that was forced on the trade union movement. I think they recognize we shall be hard put to it to maintain living standards. And that is why they and we will agree that there have got to be much fairer shares and nobody trying to opt out.
What is a reasonable annual increase in wages?
It depends on what the increase in prices is. You see, no country has succeeded in dealing with statutory wage increase. We did rather well in 1966. Because we dealt with prices, and the cost of living index rose by about 1.5% in the 12 months after it. But in no democratic country have they been able to maintain strict wage increases, and all the troubles, the miners' trouble, are because of the sheer bureaucracy and rigidity of the present system. In a democracy, you can try it once, as we did, as the Americans did. The Americans have scrapped theirs. Under a Conservative or a Labour government, it would break down if you try to do it in statutory terms. I think that's one reason why Mr. Heath has gone to the country now. He knows it.
If you return to office, you will obviously not be able to create this social climate, this social justice that you talk about straight away at a stroke, for instance. Will you therefore continue some aspects of Tory policy beyond the election? Will you immediately fulfil your pledge to abolish all controls? Will you abolish the pay board immediately?
Oh, I think the pay board will disappear very, very quickly indeed. It's highly provocative in its present form, very bureaucratic. After all, what is the problem today about the miners? What they call relativities. A year ago I said a Royal Commission should be set up. Mr. Heath rejected it. Recently he was talking about it, and that pay board has taken a whole year to produce its reports on anomalies.
So all controls go straight away, Mr. Wilson?
So far as we shall, of course, we just don't do that at a stroke. We sit down with the TUC and the CBI and decide what is the basis on which we can get the most reasonable restraint in this country. I
But
do
there
not
are
believe the
claims
pay,
in the pipeline.
The pay board has got nothing to contribute. A large number of claims have been settled. Others, the union leaders themselves, have said they're not going to push their luck too far with them. I think that's realistic, and I think they'll pursue that.
Will you give a guarantee that a Labour government will not introduce a wage freeze?
We have given that guarantee.
Thank you. May I move on now to a point made by Mr. Barber last night, that a Labour government, he said in the party political broadcast, will be putty in the hands of trade unionist extremists. While many people might not go as far as that, you would accept that a lot of people fear that you may be soft with the trade unions.
Well, that broadcast last night showed how rattled the Conservatives are at the form the election's taking. It is about prices and rents, which they were determined it shouldn't be, and Mr. Heath said it shouldn't be. Putty in the hands of extremists. I remember the Siemens strike, a very difficult situation, tying up all the ports. I attacked the extremists. I even named them in Parliament. I was strengthening the moderates. No one has ever fought extremists harder than we did. In fact, I was much criticised by Mr. Heath at the time. He was trying to find some soft, putty-like way around it, and there wasn't one. And in the case of the miners and others, of course, the government, contrary to our advice, because we know the miners, I know all the miners' leaders, they have strengthened the extremists by what they've done. And the moderates, whom I've known for so many years, were placed in an impossible position because of the strength of feeling of their own members. No, we know the people we're dealing with. People, all the moderate miners' leaders, who've been forced by Mr. Heath into almost militancy, into a strong line. They're the people who've been fighting communists, Trotskyists, and all the rest of them in their own coalfields. So have other trade union leaders. I'd like some of those moderate trade union leaders to be asked occasionally during this election onto television to tell their story of how they've beaten down the extremist minority in their own unions, and how their job in so doing has been made infinitely harder by the Conservatives.
Many people still feel, though, Mr. Wilson, that you might have done better, despite everything you have said, to urge the miners to go back to work while the Relativities Board was meeting.
Look, this is just a gimmick, just a political ploy of Mr. Heath.
It would not be a gimmick if they were back at work, would it?
It has done great damage. I think in a program with you the day the election was announced, I said we'd talked to the miners about it the previous day. They said, keep it out of politics. This is an industrial matter. If politicians start competing with one another to play with the miners' strike, it'll make it harder to call it off. Mr. Gormley wanted to do it. I supported him. But Mr. Heath made it impossible by what Mr. Gormley condemned as a political ploy that strengthened the extremists against the moderates.
The fact remains it's a strike that's not achieving anything at the moment.
It's a strike which has been forced because every possible solution was rejected. We've been through all this together so often on these broadcasts. It is a fact that Mr. Heath could have settled in November. I told him how to do it. He could have done it then. I think probably with far less cost than if it is settled on the Relativities Report, whatever that may say. It has cost the coal board tens of millions of pounds, and that means a much bigger increase in coal prices. And that's inflation than we could have had for an honourable settlement earlier. Mr. Whitelaw's initiative, spurned not by the TUC but by Mr. Heath. If there is a miners' strike, and there is, and a 3-day week with all the damage to production and exports, that is because of the obduracy of the government, who are now showing almost every day that they really needed it for political purposes. When I asked ASLEF to call it off, Mr. Heath was furious. And when they did call it off, you never saw such an unhappy man. No, it's a question of which strike is called off so far as Mr. Heath is concerned.
Right. Now, can I put to you a point discovered by our own researchers going around the country? They have found one common thing among all people, a dislike, a universal dislike of the party slanging match. And it appears from what they discover that people are looking for something rather deeper and perhaps more profound than either you or Mr. Heath are able to provide.
I agree with them. And I think last night...
Deeper than you provide.
I think last night's party political broadcast was an all-time low in British political history. McCarthyism, whether we'll get Watergate next, I don't know.
It's both of you they object to,
yes,
Mr.
because,
Wilson.
of course, if Mr. Heath makes an attack on me, and I have not used the language about him that he has about me, of course the press will put the two together as a dramatic gladiatorial thing. But during this campaign, on prices, rents, mortgage interest rates, the things we've been talking about, every night I have spelt out our program. The Conservatives haven't spelled out any programme at all. I've been taking a positive line. But of course, one little bit of conflict, a few sparks flying, and this is what is headlined in the press and in the media. The last 2-3 nights I've had some excellent Conservative hecklers. Mr. Heath doesn't allow very many of those to his meetings. And because we've had a bit of cut and thrust and good-humoured exchanges, that's what's been on television, and not, for example, the first question you put to me, as I've spelled out every day in the campaign, how we will deal with food prices. I think it's natural for the media to show excitement, and this is reflected. I do agree with you, because I'm getting the same messages you've had. It's reflected on the doorstep.
Is that why the Liberals are getting increased support?
I think the Liberals are using language quite as strong as anyone else, with the possible exception of Mr. Barber and the participants in last night's party political broadcast. I think the Liberals are getting support from both parties, mainly from the Conservatives. Conservatives who feel the government have nothing to offer on the key issues of prices. Some of our people who are worried by some of the Conservative stunts, but also because it's easy for the Liberals to be able to promise different things without having to add them up and pay for them, because they know they won't be in government.
I can turn now to the question of Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell has now announced that he will be making some speeches in this election against the common market. What is your reaction to that?
Mr. Powell is a problem for Mr. Heath. I don't seek allies outside my own party, except in the broad mass of the people of this country. Election is not about individuals, it's about policies. But the common market is an issue in this campaign. People feel it does increase prices, that many things are humiliating. And it was just ludicrous when Mr. Heath said it was not an issue in the election. But as for Mr. Heath and Mr. Powell, let them fight it out. They're all members of one party.
You can't really be very happy, though, at the prospect of Mr. Powell and all the things that he said about immigration and things in this country, actually going around urging people to vote Labour.
I have no idea what he's going to urge. All I know is that on immigration, I denounced him at the time, immediately after he'd spoken, and in the same city, in Birmingham.
He's an odd ally, though, isn't he? He's an odd ally for you.
I don't ask him to be an ally at all. If he feels strongly about the common market, well, it's up to him to say so. You see, I have abominated the things he stands for in political life and have made that plain. Nevertheless, the one thing where he has made common cause with a lot of people of all parties is in the way Parliament is bypassed by this government, with important announcements outside Parliament, with Parliament gagged on important questions like industrial relations, with all the cost that involved, with the entry into the common market just railroaded through Parliament under a guillotine without proper debate. I think that is probably what Mr. Powell wants to speak about. Michael Foot has made the same point, but we are not Powellites. Mr. Powell is a member of the Conservative Party, and I would judge an unhappy one.
Can we turn to your proposals for the state control of North Sea oil? Isn't the most dangerous thing about them not that they would reduce the profits of the oil companies, but that they would delay the exploration and the landing of that vital commodity?
Not at all. What we are proposing is very close to what the Norwegian Labour government have done. What they said was that in the job of getting the oil and gas, there will be 50% government participation with the oil companies, with the sharing of the profits. We are proposing 51%, a small but vital difference. It is not true that there's been any delay there. It is not true, as the Conservatives try to frighten us by saying, that all the oil companies will go away and not do it. They want the oil. They've got a job to do. They'll be fairly remunerated for it. In Norway, they're queuing up to get concessions and licenses to drill for oil and to get the oil. This is totally untrue. The oil and gas, of course, were nationalised by that well-known red extremist Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the actual properties of oil and gas, the royalties. But we shall ensure that the 3,000 or 4,000 million pounds a year, and some people put the figures higher, especially when you get the western seas, the Celtic seas, will accrue mainly to the British people, while the people who've done the job and produced the technology and expertise will be fairly remunerated for what they've done. But they are not going to hug the profits of what is British oil.
And yet a party committee of your own, way back in 1967, suggested that in fact nationalisation would slow the exploration up. And you've been in government long enough, Mr. Wilson, to know that the introduction of civil servants into any project slows things up, doesn't it?
I'm not talking about civil servants. After all, I directed that half of all the new licenses should be shared between the coal board or the gas board and the international oil companies. Those weren't civil servants. It just meant that half the profits would come through lower gas prices or coal prices to the British consumer. But you see, these fears you express, or that you've quoted, are not happening in Norway. It has not slowed it up. It's going like a bomb.
Right. There are some considerable more proposals for nationalisation within your document, ones that you don't talk about quite so much. I won't list them all, but they are quite extensive.
Mention any I haven't talked about, because every speech I've made, I've gone through the whole nationalisation programme. Now, you tell me one I haven't talked about.
Well, I won't. I haven't been to all your speeches, so I won't play that game. I will, however, suggest that less has been made of them generally. Is this because they embarrass you, or because they are not going to happen in the life of this next government?
I can't say what is because it hasn't happened. I have in every speech, going well back into November, December, indeed I could go a lot further back than that, I have set out entirely and frankly what our policy is for public ownership. And you know, we're not on the defensive. Oh, certainly not. Land. We believe that instead of people making millions, they've boasted on television, $250,000 in an afternoon with a land deal. That means higher council house rents, or it means higher rents or higher prices, or it means higher cost of a house for new owner occupiers. As far as that's concerned, the Conservatives have got to defend that happening. We will take it over at its existing use value. You've got derelict land somewhere in a town. We'll take it over and we will pay the derelict land price for it, not a scarcity price which is caused itself by the community giving permission to develop it. Now, that's just one case. I could go with all the others and prove that these are logical, relevant. It's not a fetish. It's not a kind of a dogma of nationalisation. We believe land should be under public ownership. We believe in each of the other cases you might like to mention, there is a case on the merits of that particular industry or service, not just a kind of flat phrase, let's nationalise something and what about that. It's not a shopping list at all. It's worked out case by case.
Mr. Wilson, the last 3 minutes, I think, in fact, can I put it to you that the facts of this election and the facts of our country are really much worse than the politicians of either party have really told us, and that whoever wins, we're in for a long, tough haul ahead?
I believe they are very grim indeed. I won't say worse than they've been told, certainly worse than was pretended by some people and by some euphoric newspapers. I think they are grim. In the first place, our balance of payments deficit last year was about 2,500 million. I remember in 1964 when it was 400 million, the biggest in all our history, the trade, I mean, and 800 million payments. We solved the problem then. It was very hard and we got unpopular. We've now got to solve a much bigger problem when we come in. The rate of inflation we've talked about at a record rate higher than in peace or in war. I believe and of course some of this is due to things over which I have not blamed the government. I've said so specifically, like the oil prices, though that's worsened, of course, by devaluation, the floating pound. Yes, I believe that it is going to be very difficult, as I've said already in this program today, even to maintain our living standards. That is a reason for more socialism, not less, for more social justice, because if things are going to be tough, then it is essential that things be more fairly shared out and that people can't make vast fortunes out of doing nothing for the community except milking it. That is why, you see, we do insist on raising pensions, on food subsidies to protect the weak. That is why we feel that yes, you're right, there are going to be tremendous sacrifices and burdens.
Will we all have to pay more in taxes? Will we all have to pay more in taxes to pay for all this?
Mr. Barber seems to imply that by what he has said. We haven't seen the books yet. No, we shan't all have to pay more in taxes.
Well,
the biggest burdens will have to be borne by the broadest backs. That's not happening under this government.
Will the majority of wage earners have to pay more in taxes, do you think?
I would have thought that is not the case on any figures I have seen. Though Mr. Barber himself dare not tell the country what budget he would introduce. I think he and we are in the position that he knows we do not know. I think it is going to be a tough budget, whoever does it. But we're not going to tax for the sake of it. If we tax, it'll be for the sake of food subsidies to lower the increase in food prices for the average family. That will be the kind of thing we shall be doing.
None of us could look forward to being better off a year from now.
I think it's very difficult for many of us to look forward to that. I think the people who are hardest hit in the community are going to have the best chance under a Labour government of being better off a year from now. And young owner-occupiers, as I say, it's going to be a hard struggle to get the housing programme going again. I think they can look forward to being better off. But those who've had it pretty good, and especially those who have their standard of living without even working for it, without earning it, I think they can expect that life, it'll be tolerable for them, better than for a lot of other people, but it isn't going to be the easy life of rich pickings they've had over the last 3 years.
In the last 40 seconds, Mr. Wilson, why are you the man to lead us through this veil of blood, sweat and tears?
That's for the British people to say, but if I were to advance a claim, we'd solved the problem before. I believe we can do it again. Secondly, I believe that we understand people. We don't need tip and run raids in an election to meet people. We're meeting them all the time. We know the problems of ordinary families, and our policies are directing to solving or helping with the problems of ordinary families.
Are you going to win, Mr. Wilson?
We believe we are, all the signs that we are, but it will be rash for any of us just to assume that. We've got to work for it. All our people have got to work for it. It's not a question of whether we're going to win or whether we deserve to win. We shall do our best to prove that we deserve to win, and then we shall win.
Mr. Wilson, thank you very much indeed.